Hi, and welcome to Take Every Thought Captive, our weekly look at the Catholic intellectual tradition and an exploration of the authors, books, and topics that have shaped Catholic thinking for 2,000 years. I'm Dr. Richard Bulzacchelli, lecturer in theology at Catholic Studies Academy, in for Jason Gale. And I'm joined this week by Tyler Ross, canon lawyer for the Diocese of Knoxville, Tennessee. Mr. Ross is a graduate of Aquinas College in Nashville, Tennessee. It was my privilege to direct his excellent thesis on Duns Scotus. He subsequently took his licentiate in canon law at the Catholic University of America. Now, like nearly all canonists employed in the diocese, Mr. Ross spends over 90% of his time on matters pertaining to marriage and nullity. But his interests range much more broadly, even into philosophy and theology in general, disciplines in which canonists also receive some formal training. Today we'll be talking about the minor orders in the traditions of the apostolic churches. What were they? How are they used? How far back do they go? This discussion will provide background for a couple of future conversations we intend to have about Pope Paul VI when he suppressed the minor orders in the Latin Rite, and Pope Francis very recently in his motu proprio, in which he opens the ministries of lector and acolyte to women, causing no shortage of commentary. Now, before we get started on that, don't forget to hit the like button, subscribe to our channel, select notifications, and of course, share this content with your friends. So right here at the beginning, I'd like to ask Mr. Ross if he would introduce himself to our audience. Our audience is probably not familiar with you.
Sure. Well, you did a great job in what you've already done. But just briefly, I was born and raised here in Chattanooga, Tennessee. I'm a product of the Diocese of Knoxville. I went to Catholic schools, K through 12. Went to Aquinas College in just neighboring Diocese of Nashville. So I love the great state of Tennessee. And since getting a job with the Diocese of Knoxville, like I said, my home diocese, I've actually had the privilege of starting or helping to start our tribunal from the ground up. So we are, as far as I know, the only diocese in the United States that at that time did not have a tribunal. There may be others out there, but I'm not aware of them.
Yeah, I think there probably were others, but
I wouldn't doubt it, but everyone I talked to in school, both classmates and professors, were like, "Oh, wow, I've never met anybody that did that." So it's been a great joy a lot and a great sorrow sometimes, because starting these things is not always easy, but it's been really good. Our bishop, heeding the words of Pope Francis and Benedict and John Paul II going back, the desire to have a tribunal in each diocese. So heeding that desire, calling upon priests of the diocese, really in a lot of ways providentially, my desire to do canon law school coinciding with my bishop's desire to erect a diocesan tribunal. So for the past year and a half now, I've been helping to set that up. I started to be employed in September of 2019. And then Rome officially erected our tribunal in July of 2020. So timing wise, I've been with the diocese for a little over a year and a half, and working technically for a tribunal for the past 7-8 months.
Yeah. So we can talk about a lot of bad things, right, that have happened in recent years. There have been a few developments in the church that many people are not happy with, but one thing that I personally think is a really good thing is the development of these tribunals. I think it was the right thing to call for more tribunals, because there were
Absolutely.
dioceses that didn't have them. Not only,
right,
I don't know how many in the United States. I couldn't say, but I'm pretty sure that
less than a handful.
Yours wasn't the only one. But I know throughout the world, many dioceses don't have tribunals, right?
Yeah.
But in the West in particular, where marriage is such a disaster, marriage is in such a disastrous state, which is bad.
Mm-hmm.
Nonetheless, though, it's an illness that we're suffering from that needs some kind of remedy. And you know, the church doesn't recognize divorce as a solution to this problem. The only thing to do is to examine the marriage and determine whether it was null or valid, right? That's the only solution we've really got.
Yep.
And so if that's our only solution, we need people who know how to diagnose it.
Who are available. Yeah. One of the things we throw around a lot is that justice is served best close to home. So for many reasons. But
right. Oh, this is another reason why this development was so good, actually, is that very point. Is many people were having their cases heard by tribunals far removed from them, right?
Yep.
I mean, so think about a person living in Chattanooga, whose case for nullity is being heard in Nashville, right?
Right.
I mean,
and that's actually like not too far. It used to be
too far, right?
It used to be sometimes that the forum of the respondent is where the case would be held. So if you've got a person in Chattanooga in the Diocese of Knoxville, and the respondent lived in Ottawa or wherever, Canada, the case would be held in Ottawa. So the person petitioning the tribunal would have to contact Ottawa, Canada. And have correspondence with them, whether or not the respondent participated.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think in the future, it would be great if I would love to have to do a conversation about marital nullity cases, and a really interesting topic. And
there's a lot to say.
Yeah, and I have some interesting anecdotes about you know, students I had in the past who were Protestants and wanted their cases to be heard by the Catholic Church. It's really kind of an interesting thing, and there's a lot to talk about there. But today our topic is the minor orders. So first of all, when we talk about the minor orders, what are we talking about? Many people in our audience may not even have ever heard of them.
Sure. Well, like as I was trained, always make distinctions.
Right.
So let's distinguish between minor orders and major orders first.
Yes.
The major orders historically, and we'll get into one of the minutiae of this in a minute, but the major orders historically are what we know as bishop, priest, and deacon. So the sacrament, right, of holy orders, the major orders.
Right. And this is so let me pause you there. This is the key. So when we say the major orders, we're talking about orders that are conferred through a sacrament.
Yes, through the sacrament, through the laying on of hands. Yeah.
Okay, go on.
So we find historically, right, if you know nothing and all you do is just go back and read the history books, we find the existence of other functions that are connected to the major orders, to bishop, priest, and deacon, but are not seen as sacraments. And those we would call the minor orders. In the Latin Church, in which myself and you belong, to which we belong, there are historically 5/4, and that's what we'll get into in a second, minor orders. So we have the porter, we have lector, exorcist, acolyte, and subdeacon. And traditionally, these were all seen as stepping stones sort of on the way to priesthood. Some people, depending on where in the world you are at any given time, you may stop, on a particular stepping stone. But traditionally, anyone who's going to be ordained a deacon and a priest went through all of these. Now, each of them had a different function, though. So porter, the Latin portus, porta would be a door, right? So the porter is the one who's in charge of the door. He was given keys to open and shut, right? His is the lowest function on the gradation in the stepping stones. That was the first step. Then you've got lector, and the lector is the one who we might call that a catechist today. His role was more to expound the word, right, to catechize the people, that kind of thing. He was given a Bible, the book of the Gospel, something to that effect. Then you have the exorcist on the next rung up, and his goal, his role, his responsibility was to perform minor exorcisms. So not major exorcisms, right? Major exorcisms are what we often think of when we hear the word exorcism, like in the movies, right? That's a major exorcism, but a minor exorcism would be deliverance prayers. So that was his role. And the next stepping stone was the acolyte, and his role is now, when we sort of transition to roles more so connected with service at the altar. So the acolyte, in the picture I have pulled up here, he's holding a thurible, so he's holding the incense. He's holding some of the sacred vessels, right, like the cruets. So his role is more connected with the altar. He is to serve those at the altar. And then you have the subdeacon, and his role is to proclaim the reading, the epistle. In the extraordinary form is the epistle. For the ordinary form, we would call it the second reading. There was no Old Testament reading in the extraordinary form. So his role was to chant the epistle. And he actually wears a chasuble of some kind. It's not called a chasuble. It's not called a dalmatic. I don't know exactly what it is called, but he does wear that extra sort of more than just a cassock and circles.
Right, so, formal vestment, yeah.
Formal vestment, right. And his is very much more closely connected to the service of the altar. He's wearing the same liturgical colors as the priest and the deacon. He's handling the sacred vessels, that kind of thing. So those were historically what you would find, at least in the Latin Church, that sort of gradation of ministers, of orders, if you were to look back in the history books.
Right. So I want to avoid like deeper metaphysical questions here, but let's think for a minute about just canonically speaking, right? What does the distinction between so like saying somebody's a cleric and saying someone is a layperson, what historically has that meant?
Different things at different times, as far as I'm aware.
I mean, specifically at a legal level.
Right, at a legal level. I mean, it would mean things like certain ecclesial benefices, right? So rights to remuneration. You get money from the church. You may be afforded certain other goods of the church.
Right. Yeah.
You know, maybe conceivably the porter. I'm sorry, I was just gonna say the porter conceivably might be given a place to stay, right? Like if he's the guy who is in charge of the door, he may have a sort of rectory unto himself at the parish, if that's his charge. Kind of speculation, but
right. So there are rights that go along with these ministries, and the idea is that once a person enters into this function, and the church recognizes him in a certain way, right? That the church is agreeing that they have certain obligations, right? The church has certain obligations. They can't just toss them aside or something, right?
Right.
So that's very interesting, because we today have attached to the word cleric, we see it as synonymous with major orders,
right?
But historically, actually, there's a distinction in the terminology, right? That this being a cleric doesn't necessarily mean that one is in major orders,
right?
So this is part of the ambiguity, right? With this discussion, because a person is recognized as having entered the clerical state.
Yep. Whereas today we enter the clerical state at diaconate. It used to be at tonsure, which we didn't mention, but is not technically a minor order. So it depends on how we talk about these things. And this is kind of where the language matters, right? Some people consider tonsure to be, as far as I'm aware, some kind of entrance into minor orders, but not an order unto itself. Entrance into the clerical state in some places, not so much in other places, or having certain rights with tonsure. In some places, others not.
Doesn't actually have any particular function, right? I mean, he doesn't do anything.
He doesn't do anything.
He just has a bald head, right? I mean, that's
or
it.
Some of his hair is cut off in some way.
Some of his hair is cut off, yeah. And but he's positioned in such a way that he's now on a trajectory to enter into these other things.
He's connected in some way with the major orders, with the sacrament.
Now, these go back a really long way, actually, right? And maybe not all these specific ones, but different ones. And we have different, in different rites of the church, they don't all have the same minor orders, right? But I want to think about this idea of being a porter, for example, right? Or being a lector, okay? A very interesting thing about these particular functions historically. We can't relate to this today. The idea that there's some special function to the guy who opens and closes the door. But when you realize that in the primitive church, and actually even later than that, in the early church, prior to, the end of the period of open persecution, right? So up until about the Council of Nicaea or so, right? There was real danger of being persecuted for the profession of the Christian faith, and the Eucharist was understood by the government as cannibalism. This is actually what Justin Martyr is accused of. And he interestingly enough, precisely because the church does and has always taught that the Eucharist is the true body, blood, soul, and divinity of Jesus Christ, Justin Martyr couldn't actually weasel out of that accusation, right? He got convicted of it anyway. And so, he makes the whole bloodless sacrifice thing argument and everything, and he's trying to make the point that cannibalism, as is understood under the law, involves killing someone and eating him in pieces, and that's not what's happening here. But in any case, he's convicted, right? So the whole point here is who gets in the church and who doesn't, who has to leave at a certain time and who can stay. That's a serious determination, right? And even today we have in our rituals for Christian initiation in the Latin Rite, one of the things that we do is we have a ritual for receiving the creed. Now, in the ancient church, that was the point at which you were permitted to remain, right? You were permitted to remain. So before, once you got to the creed, you had to go, right? And the porter was one of the people. He actually had an important job. Because he told people, okay, it's time for you guys to leave. You guys can come in. You guys can stay. You guys have to go.
He's akin to what we might call today an usher.
Sort of, yeah. But whether today an usher helps you find a seat, welcomes you at the door. There's no idea that you can't stay. Right.
In the Latin church.
So there was a charge that belonged to this guy. And it was a responsibility. People's lives literally depended on it. So it is an interesting thing. It's important. It was an important function.
And then carrying on though from there, after Christianity was legalized, and then especially after it was made the official religion, the porter still exercised this role of guarding the door or standing watch over the door, because it pertains to those in orders to watch the doors of the church, right? Like they are the ones who guard the house of God, whether or not there's people trying to kill you. You know what I mean? Like it's God's house and they're the ones given charge over it. Right. So just to highlight that connection with, again, the minor order, the connection with the minor order to the major order.
So let's go back. How early do we see indications of the minor orders?
Yeah. So to my research, the earliest we can find of anything mentioning the roles of the minor orders was in the year 252. And we'll unpack it. So I'll read a quote. This is from Pope Cornelius to Fabius of Antioch, Bishop Fabius of Antioch. Pope Cornelius says, he, speaking about novation, which we can talk about in a second, novation knew that there were in this Church of Rome, and then he enumerates them, 46 priests, 7 deacons, 7 subdeacons, 42 acolytes, and 52 exorcists, lectors, and porters.
Yeah.
So there's a lot to unpack there. Definitely the first thing to note is the year 252. What can we say about that year?
Yeah, well, it's pretty darn early.
It's pretty darn early.
This is before the Council of Chalcedon.
Yep.
Before the Council of Ephesus.
Yep.
Before the Council of Nicaea.
Yep.
I mean, it's early.
It's early.
And so we're talking about what, 252? I mean, this is before there's any kind of formal, there's no definition of rites.
Yeah.
By rites here, I mean R-I-T.
Yes.
E, right?
R-I-T-E,
Right.
yes, yeah.
So I'm talking about there's no real distinction here in any formal way between an Eastern rite of the church and a Latin rite of the church, right?
Right.
There are no major divisions. There have been a few heresies here and there, but like nothing like any kind of great schism that divides the church in some cataclysmic way, right?
And before Christianity was legal.
Before Christianity, that's right. Before Christianity was legal. So people are still being persecuted. In fact, Novation, who's mentioned here, right, was the first anti-pope. And the reason that Novation actually got into that situation of being the first anti-pope was because after a persecution where the see was left vacant, he was kind of ushered in very quickly by a subset of the population, right? So it wasn't recognized as being a real quorum of people lawfully charged with electing the successor. So it's sort of like a clandestine sort of move to put him in the chair.
Mm-hmm.
And he was he was a North African rigorist in sort of in line with Tertullian, for example, right? And he was really super, super strict about whether the church even could forgive people, right? Absolve people of apostasy, which is kind of weird, right? But
yeah,
they actually held the view that the church can't actually absolve that sin. Anyway, so we eventually dealt with that, but we're talking about here just after the period of Novation. And it's still when the church when Christianity is not legal. So it's very early. Right. Now, going back a little bit further, right, we don't see mention specifically of these minor orders. We don't find them in the letter of Clement to the Corinthians, in which he does talk about the major orders. We don't see it in the writings of Ignatius of Antioch, where he too talks about the major orders. So we have to believe somewhere between Ignatius, who died roughly 107, and this particular letter in, what was it, 252, right?
252.
Somewhere in that period developed the minor orders, right? So there's our window. That's our window. We could say, I think, right, that if you mentioned to me before that this we've got a catalog.
The idea that this is they're numbered, right? They're not estimates, right? Specifically 46 priests, right? 7 subdeacons, 42 acolytes, and 52 exorcist lectors and porters. They lump all those together, but these are not estimates. Like, they knew who these people were. It was, we can surmise, right, that this was a thing that had been in place for a while. This is something they were used to doing. So maybe to the point where even for them, they could say our tradition of the minor orders. They could refer to it as a tradition. Maybe that's a little bit of speculation, but
so, I mean, this is even, and he's saying this is from the time of Novation. That Novation took note of this.
Yeah.
So,
yep.
So, in less than 150 years' time,
yeah,
you had the development of a tradition strong enough that by the time you get to 252, or earlier than that, right? You've got these lists, catalogs. We know we have names associated with it. Presumably. It's well documented.
Yeah. And the other thing to note about it was that he's writing to Bishop Fabius, who's in Antioch, which, as we know, is really far away from Rome.
Right.
It's, that's not a drive, right? Like,
yeah, in the ancient world, in fact, okay, so putting it in context, Ignatius of Antioch, right?
Yep,
the letters we have from Ignatius of Antioch were written while he was en route from Antioch to Rome, where he was going to be executed.
Yep.
So he would stop at the various port cities along the way and meet with people. This was a long journey. In the ancient world, it took a while for Ignatius to get from point A to point B.
Right.
Right. So your point is, right, by saying this?
My point is that presumably, again, this is a little bit of a speculation, but reasonable, I think, that Pope Cornelius is writing to Bishop Fabius as if Fabius has some kind of knowledge of this thing called minor orders, right?
Yeah.
That, like, we have these things in Rome, and you know about them.
Yeah, so, that seems to be the obvious, right? The obvious presumption is that the audience, right? Cornelius' audience is familiar with the terminology.
Yes.
He knows the reference.
Yeah.
Across great distances.
Across great distances.
Which means that we have a widespread practice, right? It's not just that we have a tradition that has somehow been established inside of a period of 150 years, but
and likely did not arise independently from each other. There has to be some kind of connection between the two, some common source or tradition that they're drawing on.
Right. So we have every reason to believe, I mean, if I had to throw a dart at the board, right, and sort of pick a date where I think we probably saw the first examples of something that somebody might call, in whatever terminology they would use at the time, a minor order.
Yeah.
I would throw that dart. I would aim for about, personally, 150. That's where I'm. Okay. That's where I'm guessing you would hit, because the 100-year period, right, would allow for a pretty wide spread. When you think about it, right, how many generations is that? It's go on an average. If you think about a generation of being about
5 years, maybe.
Yeah,
4,
5 generations. Yeah. So you've got, that gives time for it to grow and to spread throughout the church, and to become highly developed enough that this kind of conversation can happen. It seems to me that's a pretty reasonable estimate.
Yeah. But and just oh, sorry.
We don't know for sure, but
right. A lot of it is speculation. The other thing, I think, final thing to note about this little quote here is where the letter's coming from and where it's going to, contextually. So Rome, right, being the imperial capital city, it's the city, the eternal city. Not much more needs to be said about Rome. But Antioch, I remember learning in my Eastern canon law class, taught by a Maronite core bishop. He was likening Antioch at the time to New York City of today, and Rome to Washington, D.C., where Antioch would be like the cultural center, perhaps the most populous city in the empire. When you want to take the gospel somewhere, right? Like his analogy was, if Jesus were to have become incarnate in modern day America rather than Israel way back when, 2,000 years ago, what are the first places we would take the gospel? Probably we would take them to Washington, D.C. We could say a lot of things about taking the gospel to D.C. maybe. And to New York City, right? Perhaps Los Angeles as sort of like a West Coast version of New York City. But the idea is that these are like the places where all the Christians are, most of them at least. They represent certainly the two halves, in a sense, of the Christian world at that time, Rome being in the West and Antioch being in the East. And especially as we remember where the disciples were first called Christians.
Now, I would want to argue, of course, that Alexandria was a major place at this time too, right? They had the library, and they had that. There was all the philosophical dialogue that was going on. And
you had the Desert Fathers.
But the point is basically that Antioch is a very important city,
right?
And we know that it's a very important city historically to Christianity, right? And we know from the very tenor of the letters of Ignatius of Antioch, and we know from
Acts,
we know from Acts of the Apostles for sure. But we know but I'm saying as far as, the post New Testament period,
sure.
We know from the role that those letters played in the life of the church, how they were preserved, and even that people seem to have presumed to build upon them. There was a pseudo Ignatius, and people, many scholars believe, that we have different versions of those letters, right? And many scholars believe that people thought even to embellish them. That the figure of Ignatius of Antioch was so important in the primitive church that we can speculate with a great deal of confidence, right? That was a very important place,
right?
So this dialogue between the Bishop of Rome and the Bishop of Antioch is one that matters, and it probably tells us a great deal about what the church looked like at that time.
Yeah. And one last thing too is, speaking of this concept of the minor orders being present in various locations throughout the church, even today, right? If you're to look around the churches with the apostolic succession, so you've got, Rome in the West, you've got Constantinople, you've got of course, Alexandria and Antioch, all we've already mentioned, but even like the Assyrian Church of the East, you've got the Armenians, right? The Armenian Apostolic Church, the modern day Copts, which would be the Alexandrian Christian. They all have their own versions of the minor orders. Not all of them are numerated the same way.
Right.
Not all of them have exorcists as a minor order, for example, but they all have them. They all have minor orders. So that would lead us really to the conclusion that the minor orders, because it's attested to so early in the thing we just read, and a fortiori its utter universal practice, would lead us to conclude that it is perhaps not apostolic because of the letters that you mentioned, the even earlier ones that don't mention it, but sort of, we might say maybe quasi-apostolic or pseudo-apostolic, where we might say if the apostles were alive to see the spread of Christianity by the time the minor orders did arise, they would be sanctioned by the apostles. It would have been something they would have done.
Yeah, I think we would. I mean, we might say that it's it's a venerable tradition,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And for various practical reasons, probably the apostolic church saw fit to to do this thing, right? I
Hmm.
mean, this was a thing that that the church saw fit to do at a very early stage and
Yeah.
widely.
Yep.
Um, so, right, even though there what exactly the different ones are
Yeah.
is that varies from region to region, but that
Right.
there is such a category of ministry
Yep.
is that's universal until very recently
Hmm.
in history.
Yep.
So so let's ask the question: why do we have why do we call them why do we call them minor orders as opposed to just functions or something?
Yeah.
What do you think is going on there?
Yeah. So it seems, I think in answering that question, we talk about lex orandi, lex credendi, um, and then a lot of times people add that third one on there, lex vivendi.
Uh-huh.
So the law of praying, lex orandi, is the law, the lex credendi, the law of believing. So how we pray is an indication of what we believe. And then lex vivendi, we could even say, if you take a look at how we live, the law of living is also an indication of how we believe. So um, with that sort of hermeneutic, that sort of interpretive lens, maybe
Mm-hmm.
we would see a very strong connection between the minor orders as non-sacramental ministries and roles with the major orders, specifically with the diaconate. So St. Thomas Aquinas, um, I'm aware that he says this, and I just haven't done the research to know if anybody else does, but he will say that the minor orders are their roles are roles that are contained in the diaconate,
Uh-huh.
so that as we sort of spell out those different ones, porter, lector, exorcist, acolyte, subdeacon, um, that those are all roles that are included, sort of packaged in the package deal, quote unquote, of the diaconate. And then over time, they were just listed as separate things. So to frame it like in terms of, these are things that an ordained man is called to do, right? Like the deacon is the one who's supposed to do these things ordinarily.
Uh-huh.
It pertains to the sacrament of orders to do them. So I think firstly, we need to make that sort of highlight distinction of the connection between the minor orders and the major orders. Like, you can't separate them. Like a difference, another distinction we could say would be the exorcist, right? Is one I like to give. If the exorcist is connected and in some way participates in the ministry of the deacon,
Uh-huh.
it pertains to the exorcist to pray deliverance prayers. So you can have the exorcist pray deliverance prayers over you as option A, or option B, you can ask like your buddy, right? Hey, can you pray some deliverance prayers over me? That's option B. It seems to me that like the sense of the faith, the sensus fidei that we all have,
Mm-hmm.
would incline us to ask the exorcist to pray the deliverance prayers rather than your friend, because of his connection to the sacrament, right? So he doesn't receive himself a sacrament, right? The church doesn't have the authority to institute new sacraments. But we do understand this, and this is what I think we can tease out here, is what is the connection? What's the connection between the minor order and the diaconate? The thing that pertains to the sacrament itself.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So to answer that question a little bit, I think it's an open question, but
Yeah.
But I think one of the things to note about the deacon is that historically widespread throughout the church, right? And for a very long period of time, the deacon has been associated with the Levitical priesthood.
Mm-hmm.
That's something that the typical member of our audience today may not have any awareness of at all, right? Because
unless they go to the Easter Vigil.
What's that? Unless you go to the Easter Vigil, that's right. But it could pass you by.
It could.
But that part where he says,
"Who has counted me worthy to number me among the Levites?"
Yeah,
the deacon chanting the Exultet.
Right, and the deacon, and only the deacon can say that part, right?
Yep.
So, so it's a weird, right?
Yep.
I mean, because you would expect, what is he, a Levitical priest? Is he offering? Does the deacon secretly offer like these animal sacrifices? No. The idea is that the sacrifices that pertained to the Levitical priesthood have since been transcended in the new covenant, and so he doesn't offer them, right? But the idea is that he's a priest in that way,
right? He's still set apart,
kind of a priest. Not by lineage, right? Because the Levitical priesthood was actually passed by lineage.
Yeah.
But in through grace, right? He is a priest in that way, in the way that he points entirely toward the Eucharist.
Yeah.
Right. And he can't celebrate it.
Yeah.
He's at the altar participating in the sacrifice of the Eucharist because the sacrifice is proper to him as Levite, pointed in that direction.
Yeah.
That's my understanding of it, right? I mean, it's a part of the history of the church that we have talked about the deacons as Levites.
As Levites. So how are you connecting the deacon as Levite to minor orders?
Yeah, so there's no part of being a member of the minor orders that allow that puts one in that kind of a relationship exactly. Do you see what I mean?
Yep.
They're more like functionaries. They're sort of like functionaries of the diaconal responsibilities vis-a-vis care of the faithful or something, but not but they don't have really anything to do with that sacrificial dimension. Does that make any sense?
Yeah.
I'm not 100% sure about this response. I'm speculating.
Playing around with it. Yeah, I mean, that seems sort of connected to like the idea of the deacon being in the ministry of service, that there is a functional aspect to the role of the deacon, but that it's functional, but more than that, because he is still connected to Christ. Like he does receive a share in Christ's ministry on earth in some way or another. And so that would be, I think, the sort of distinction that we want to toy out between the minor orders as orders, right, connected to a sacrament, and the mere function that they perform, right?
So also the deacon is a corporate person.
Yes.
In his sacramental ministry, right?
Yep.
In other words, like a priest, this is basically what priesthood involves: being a corporate person.
Yeah.
In such a way that you take the whole community up into yourself. And
it's a part of headship.
Traditional. That, by the way, that's traditional in the language of Ignatius of Antioch. When you go back to his letters, his whole ecclesiology, right, passes through the ordained ministers, through the Eucharist.
Yeah.
Right.
Was he the guy on recapitulation? That whole like idea of recapitulation in Christ, or am I thinking of somebody else?
Totally in line. No, I mean, I associate with that whole idea of recapitulation with both John, the author of the gospel, right? And also St. Paul. The idea of being the body of Christ and all this kind of stuff. Everything comes together under Christ as head.
Yes. Right. It's headship theology for me.
Yeah, that's
what
right.
It means to be head is to, in your singular person, somehow, maybe we would say mystically, or in theology we may say mystically, or in philosophy maybe we'll say like metaphysically, somehow contain other people, like in your singular person, or like you represent everybody on your own.
Yeah, it's very strange, but it's very biblical.
Yeah. Oh yeah. I mean, Adam.
Right. The whole the Adamic typology.
Yeah.
That's right. I mean, Paul builds on that, right?
Yeah.
So if you think about, as a Levitical priest, the deacon is a corporate person.
Yep.
None of the minor orders can say that.
Right. And we were talking about this earlier too. The tradition of calling deacon Father Deacon, which exists in some of the Eastern churches, and as you were saying, in some monasteries in the West as well.
Yeah.
The idea of course, Father being the corporate person. We call him Father because he is able to be a corporate person. He is a corporate person.
So so there's a connection to the sacrament, right?
Yeah.
And but it's not a sacrament.
Right.
And this is one of the hard things, I think, for people to understand about Catholic thought. It's hard for Catholics to understand, right?
Yeah.
We have these things called sacraments, and the way that term has come to be used, I mean, look, we can have all kinds of interesting arguments about, when did the word sacrament, sacramentum in Latin, right? When did that come to mean what we mean by it today? Well, that's an interesting discussion, but given that we know what we mean by it now, what I want to know is, we've refined our definition of the term sacrament, right? So that now when we use it with great precision. That wasn't always true, but we're still identifying the same realities.
Yeah.
Okay. Do you get what I'm saying?
Yeah. Oh yeah.
Right. A looser definition doesn't necessarily mean that we had a looser concept.
Right.
All right. We refined the definition to deal more precisely with our concepts. So, so we have this distinction today between sacrament and sacramental.
Yeah.
There are a lot of sacramentals, right?
Yeah. The idea would be that the sacramental, well, okay, let's back up a minute though, because a sacrament is what? A visible sign of an invisible grace is one definition that people.
Right. Yeah. In a nutshell.
Yeah. An outward sign that communicates grace. Another definition. But a sacramental is more like a thing which, having been blessed, which itself means set aside for holy use, can now be a sort of channel of grace itself, but not in the same sense that a sacrament can, right? Because we would say the sacraments are ex opere operato, right, by the working worked.
So that's an important part of the whole discussion, right? Is what we say about the way sacraments actually work.
Yeah. Whereas a sacramental, like I can have my rosary blessed, and it's a sacramental, and as most of our audience might know, once you get a thing blessed, you are not to throw it away, right?
Yeah, it's a holy object.
It's a holy object. Yep. You bury it. Usually is one thing most people do, much like we do bodies, right? Because we are set aside for holy use at baptism, at confirmation, anytime we receive a blessing. But they're not like sort of infallible means of grace either, not like a sacrament is. We don't know that God is going to give grace through those things, like we do know that God gives grace through the sacraments, and we don't know exactly how he's going to use these things, like we do know Like we can identify what graces are given in which particular sacrament, but we don't know exactly what graces he's going to choose to give through any particular sacramental.
Yeah. So you would say though that there's so the person in minor orders, right?
Yeah.
Is, at least in the exercise of the minor order, kind of like a sacramental.
Kind of.
Analogous, yeah. Right?
I would say maybe, yeah, again, working this out, but sort of like a sacramental. Yeah. That he's not a sacrament, but he is a means of grace.
Yeah.
In some way or another.
In the performance of the function the church has set aside for him to be responsible for doing, right?
Right. Such that there's a difference between him doing his thing and as an ordained, or maybe we'll put air quotes around it, but well, he is ordained orders, whatever. As so going back to that exorcist example, there's a difference between the exorcist praying the deliverance prayer and Joe Schmo praying a deliverance prayer. You want the exorcist because of this, him being a sacramental or quasi-sacramental in his own person.
Because he himself is, in a certain sense, the church doing something. Right. The church as church doing something.
Right.
I think you might give that kind of an explanation.
Yeah, which gets back to the corporate personality thing.
Yeah, although he himself isn't, right?
Right.
But behind him is the church acting.
Yeah. But in virtue of that connection to the sacrament of holy orders.
Yeah. So let's talk about this. So this is there's theology here yet to be done, right?
A lot, I think.
Yeah. But let's look at the matter from this point of view. We're getting a little long. Here, this conversation can go on, but I want to look toward the reason why in the past the minor orders have been, if they're not major orders, right? Mm-hmm. Why have the minor orders been restricted to men?
Yeah.
Well, this is kind of where we're getting up against this problem with Francis' program.
Yep. The foreshadowing. Again, I think it goes back to the connection with orders. If to dispense grace in a particular way belongs to a man particularly and not a woman, then to participate in that as the minor orders participate in the diaconate, it would seem to be the case that also needs to be a person capable of doing the same thing. Does that make sense? Like,
I do. Let me approach it from another point of view.
Yeah.
Okay, so I would probably turn the thing in the other direction, which would be to turn it toward the altar. Mm-hmm. What we have with the trajectory of the minor orders historically has been that they've been associated with entrance into the clerical state, right? And which ultimately means a life dedicated to service of the church, ultimately as a participant in major orders, right? So I think historically speaking, I can't say that I'm 100% sure about this, right? And I don't know if anyone really knows.
Yeah.
But at least as far as it has come to be the case, as it had come to be the case in the West from a fairly early date, these ministries came to be part of the induction of a person into the ordained ministry, the properly ordained ministry.
Yeah, so you're coming out of like a sort of like a final cause kind of argument. Like, these things are ordered towards a thing which only men can have. So it's fitting that only men have the things ordered to the other.
Why are you walking down this path if you know that at the end of the hallway is a door through which you cannot pass?
Yeah.
Right. That's kind of the question. And I think that is possibly at least part of the reason that historically these ministries have been reserved to men.
Yeah, I think that's definitely part of the reason too. I mean, think about the people who like first instituted these things, like in 150 or so, whenever you were saying. You've got a bishop sitting there with a deacon next to him, and the deacon is like, man, I don't have time to like do the doors. Like, I've got too much other stuff going on. I don't have time to do this. What's the bishop going to do? He might think something like, well,
who can you trust?
Who can you trust? But also, like, to have the function of like doorkeeper, porter, like belongs to an ordained man, to an ordained person, a man.
Well, it goes to the power of the keys, right? I mean, like, who comes in, who goes out?
Right. It pertains to the power of the keys. So if you're going to think of the porter, just using that as one example, as participating in the sacrament, right? Like maybe he like receives some like part of the sacrament. I don't know how that works. I don't know, but
he receives a charge to perform a task from the person to whom that task belongs.
Yeah. But in the same way, right? Like maybe we wouldn't want to say this, but it would also kind of be like, it doesn't make a difference whether you have the exorcist doing the exorcising or the acolyte, right? Like the guy who's just like the next step up, or maybe even the deacon, like in as much as they're both charged with deliverance prayers, the exorcist and the deacon. The exorcist is doing in his minor exorcisms everything that the deacon could do. He's not doing anything less. Like the deacon is giving him his full authority of deliverance prayers, or his full authority to open and close the door to the church as porter, whatever else. You know what I mean? Like he's not like giving him a part of his authority to perform exorcism, deliverance prayers. It's like the whole thing. Like, do you want the exorcist or the deacon? I don't care. Do you want the exorcist or the layman? No, I want the exorcist.
Yeah. So, okay. So let me give you some perspective here on the primitive church and how it differs from today, which might help us to understand, again, this tradition, right, of reserving these things for men. Well, today people kind of decide to become priests, right? They decide they want to enter into the seminary, and then they go and have a sit down with the bishop, and they come to terms with this. But but back in the primitive church, it wasn't like that at all. Mm-hmm. People were literally called, right? I mean, like
some were dragged in chains.
Yeah, some were dragged in chains. So, like, what we're talking about is these were the men of the church who were gradually picked, right? Chosen to be given these responsibilities.
Yep.
And from among those men, some would be chosen to enter into major orders.
Yep.
So it's not about you deciding this or that. And for that reason, because the whole logic of it historically traces back to who is being called, right? Into the sacramental ministry. I think it makes sense for us to say that these functions can only be performed by men. Does that make sense? It's not an ontological thing, but given the connection.
I would say it makes sense that it's that your argument is a good fittingness argument. Whereas I think
that used to be considered a very strong argument. theologically.
Yes, but it's not a good ontological argument for me. I would not.
Yeah, so I'm not making an ontological argument.
Yeah. So a fittingness argument, for sure. I mean, we talk about fittingness arguments with respect to the Immaculate Conception, and that seems to work. But for disciplinary matters, fittingness, right? Like minor orders would be a disciplinary thing. It's a canonical thing. We can do away with them, and we have. But my focus is, it would be more on the ontological part of it, actually, where we have this connection, and there's this connection with like grace, like the minor orders, like the Exorcist isn't just your buddy doing deliverance prayers. It's like,
yeah, I get it.
Dude with the backing.
You're trying to argue that there actually is a difference in what's being done, or in how what's being done affects the outside world.
Right, which is why we're calling the people in minor orders, the men in minor orders, like a sacramental of sorts, right? Because they are like the unblessed rosary is different than a blessed rosary. Yeah. Right? Like I would rather pray with the blessed rosary than the unblessed rosary, even though they look the same on the outside, and I'm going to pray the same prayers on each rosary, or whatever else.
Yeah.
And it's because, for me, of that connection with the sacrament, that getting back to that gender question, that like everything you're saying, yes, and then more so because it takes a man to participate in a thing reserved only to men.
Yeah. So I think you got to mash these two things up together. Mm-hmm. And ask yourself, why does that pertain? We're long on time, so we're not going to get into this discussion, but if you ask yourself why does this thing pertain only to men, I think the answer to that question is kind of bound up in the fittingness argument.
Sure. Because they build on each other.
To the altar.
Yeah.
And the altar is reserved to men.
Right.
So you get what I'm saying?
Yeah. Yeah.
So anyway, this is a great discussion, but we have more. Not today, but we do have more. Next time, we have two more conversations we're going to have.
We hinted at them.
Next time, we're going to talk about Paul VI and when he decided to suppress the minor orders in the Latin Rite. And then we're finally going to get to Pope Francis, motu proprio, opening up the ministries of lector and acolyte to women. All right, so this is part of a long conversation, and you've heard part 1. Don't forget to like and subscribe and to share and to ask to be notified of future content. So Tyler, thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
And we're looking forward to having you next time.
Yeah, absolutely. I can't wait.